In the early morning haze of Concord, Massachusetts, the year was 1845. A man, thin, intense, and deliberate, stepped into the woods with an axe and a notebook. He wasn't a farmer, though he would till the land. He wasn't a hermit, though solitude was his companion. His name was Henry David Thoreau. To understand Thoreau, we must first understand the world he walked away from. The United States was a young country, bruised from its revolutionary birth, but swelling with ambition. Industrialization roared through cities, and railroads cut deep scars into the wilderness. The American spirit was loud, restless, and material. But Thoreau, he walked at a different pace. Born in 1817, Henry was a child of a changing world, and yet he never quite belonged to it. He was the son of a pencil maker, a Harvard graduate with dirt on his boots and poetry in his blood. He studied logic and rhetoric, but found no comfort in career or coin. While others chased prosperity, Henry asked, "What is the purpose of life, if not to live deliberately?" He devoured the wisdom of the ancients, Plato, Confucius, the Bhagavad Gita, but he wasn't merely a scholar, he was an embodiment of the old soul in a new world. To Thoreau, civilization was not progress, it was noise, and in that noise, he feared, the soul was being lost. The clamor of machines, the push toward profit, the cruelty of slavery, all of it weighed on him. In the eyes of many, he was an eccentric, but in his quiet rebellion, he became something rarer, a moral compass. And so, on July 4th, 1845, a symbolic day, the anniversary of America's independence, Thoreau declared his own. He built a small cabin by Walden Pond, a half-mile from any neighbor. 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days. That is how long he stayed, not to escape society, but to better see it. He wrote, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach." What did he discover there? What truth lies hidden in the stillness of a pond, or the silence between falling leaves? When Henry David Thoreau stepped into the woods near Walden Pond, he did not do so to escape the world, but to confront it, stripped bare of illusion. What he sought was not survival in the wilderness, but something harder, truth. Walden was not a retreat, it was a laboratory for the soul. His home was no more than 10 feet wide. He grew beans and potatoes, drank from the pond, and kept company with owls, foxes, and the rustling wind. His expenses for the first 8 months amounted to just over $28. He recorded every detail, not as a ledger of economy, but a journal of freedom. To Thoreau, poverty was not disgrace, it was clarity. He observed nature with the intensity of a philosopher and the heart of a poet. In the movements of squirrels or the thawing of ice, he found metaphors for human life, its struggle, its beauty, its impermanence. He wrote, "We can never have enough of nature. We must be refreshed by the sight of inexhaustible vigor." The seasons became his teachers. Summer taught him abundance, autumn, impermanence, winter, solitude, and spring, hope. But solitude, for Thoreau, was not loneliness, it was communion. In the silence of the woods, he discovered how noisy the human mind had become, and in simplifying his life, he deepened it. He pondered civilization with a clarity sharpened by distance. He saw its rituals, its ambitions, and its contradictions, and he asked questions most were too busy to ask. What is a life well lived? Must we always be in motion? Is progress truly progress if it costs our souls? He was not against society, but he saw how it traded depth for speed, wisdom for profit, connection for convenience, and he knew we could do better. Walden was a mirror, and in it, Thoreau saw both the brilliance of nature and the blindness of man. But the forest could not contain him forever. His time at Walden was never meant to be a permanent exile. It was an experiment, and when it ended, he returned, not as a recluse, but as a quiet revolutionary. In the quiet after Walden, Thoreau emerged not as a man changed by the woods, but as a man more fully himself. He had stripped life to its essentials, and seen, perhaps more clearly than most, the gap between the world as it is and the world as it could be. What he returned to was a nation in moral crisis. The United States was expanding, yes, but at what cost? The land itself was soaked in contradictions. A republic founded on liberty, yet stained by slavery. A people proud of freedom, yet eager to crush it abroad and within. And then came the war between the United States and Mexico. To Thoreau, this war was not patriotic. It was theft, cloaked in the flag. A conflict driven by greed and an insatiable hunger for land. Much of it intended to expand slavery into new territories. noise. In protest, Thoreau did something radical. Not loud, not violent, but resolute. He refused to pay the poll tax, a small act. But in a democracy, even silence is a statement. For this refusal, he was arrested, hauled to jail, a single night behind bars, but one that would echo for generations. That night, staring through iron bars, Thoreau asked himself, who is truly free? The man who walks the streets in blind obedience, or the one who stands alone for what is right? From that brief imprisonment emerged one of the most powerful essays in American history, Civil Disobedience, a title that has become a banner for movements across centuries. Thoreau's simple declaration that the individual's conscience must come before the laws of the state was more than philosophy. It was a blueprint for nonviolent resistance. He wrote that it is not enough to vote against injustice. One must not participate in it. If the law makes you an agent of oppression, then the only moral path is refusal. A century later, that idea would inspire Mahatma Gandhi in the struggle against British rule. And then again, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., sitting in his Birmingham jail, would quote Thoreau, finding strength in the words of a quiet American who once sat alone behind bars. What makes Thoreau timeless is not just his insight, but his integrity. He did not shout to be heard. He lived his beliefs so completely, the world eventually leaned in to listen. From the silence of a pond to the silence of a jail, Thoreau showed that the soul's allegiance is not to the powerful, but to the just. Long after he left Walden, Thoreau never truly left the woods. He carried it with him, not just in memory, but in language. Nature had become his lens. Through it, he examined everything: power, mortality, time, and truth. For Henry David Thoreau, writing was not a craft. It was a calling. He wrote slowly, obsessively, each word like a stone placed deliberately. His journals alone span over 2 million words, and within them, we find not just observations of birds and seasons, but maps of the soul. He once wrote, "How vain it is to sit down to write when you have not stood up to live." It was not just a warning, it was a standard. He wrote only what life had carved into him. But Thoreau was not a man at peace with all things. He admired the calm of nature, but not its cruelty. He detested the triviality of modern life, yet often battled his own contradictions. He was fierce in his ideals, and yet deeply introverted. A philosopher in the body of a woodsman. He had few close friends, fewer possessions, and almost no interest in fame. Yet his thoughts burned with intensity. He believed most men lived lives of quiet desperation, trapped by routine, debt, and the expectations of others. Against this, he placed a single rebellious idea: live deliberately, not reactively, not according to custom or fear, but with intention, with conscience, with presence. If Thoreau were alive today, what would he see? A world more connected than ever, yet perhaps lonelier. A civilization hurtling forward, but rarely asking, where to? He did not reject society because he hated people. He withdrew because he loved something deeper, an authentic life, unfiltered, unbound. Thoreau was not trying to be a prophet. He was simply asking better questions. He believed that every human being contained a kind of wildness, a natural integrity that society tries to tame. In wildness is the preservation of the world, he wrote. Not wilderness alone, but wildness of spirit. The untamed self, that wildness still lives within us. But like Walden Pond, it grows quieter by the year. Perhaps it takes a man like Thoreau to remind us how to listen again. By the late 1850s, the United States stood on the edge of rupture. Slavery, no longer a silent shame, was now a national wound, festering, exposed, and undeniable. Henry David Thoreau had long warned that a nation built on injustice would someday hear its foundation crack. And in these final years, he did not turn away, he turned toward the fire. Though he had never loved crowds, Thoreau now spoke publicly and powerfully against the great sin of his nation. His voice, once quiet and solitary, grew sharp, targeted, urgent. He defended John Brown, the radical abolitionist who had taken up arms and led a raid on Harper's Ferry. While many saw Brown as a fanatic or a madman, Thoreau saw something else: moral clarity. In a plea for Captain John Brown, Thoreau praised him not as a warrior, but as a martyr, a man who risked everything to strike at the heart of slavery. "I know of no more manly man," Thoreau wrote, "no more heroic spirit." It was not a popular opinion. Even among his peers, Thoreau's defense of Brown was seen as dangerous. But he did not care. He had never been concerned with comfort or consensus. He once said, "Any man more right than his neighbors constitutes a majority of one. But time was slipping away. Behind his fierce words, Thoreau's body was weakening. Tuberculosis, an illness he had battled for years, was tightening its grip. By 1861, the year the Civil War began, Thoreau could no longer walk without pain. He died quietly on May 6, 1862. He was 44 years old. His final words, "Now comes good sailing," a fitting farewell from a man who had always navigated by stars of his own choosing. He was buried near his mentors, Emerson and Hawthorne, on a quiet hill in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. A small stone marks the place. It reads simply, Henry. No titles, no monuments, just a name and a legacy that refuses to fade. In the stillness of Walden, in the ink of his journals, in the courage of his dissent, Thoreau lives on. He reminds us that a life of integrity may be quiet, but it is never small. He was a man who walked alone, not to escape the world, but to understand it. A rebel without violence, a philosopher without dogma, a voice still echoing. In our final part, we'll explore how his ideas outlived his body, how Thoreau's words crossed oceans, inspired revolutions, and lit fires that still burn today. When Henry David Thoreau died in 1862, few mourned beyond Concord. He had not held office. He had not led armies. His life, to the casual observer, seemed small. An eccentric man who lived in the woods, wrote long essays, and refused to pay taxes. But history has never been written only by generals. Sometimes it is whispered forward by the uncompromising voice of a man who dared to live by truth alone. Decades later, halfway across the world, a young Indian lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi discovered civil disobedience. He devoured it, line by line, as if reading the words of a friend he had never met. In Thoreau's defiance, Gandhi found not violence, but dignity, and from that, he shaped a revolution. Gandhi wrote, "Thoreau is one of the greatest and most moral men America has produced." Martin Luther King Jr., too, stood on Thoreau's shoulders. In the heat of Jim Crow, when silence was betrayal, King echoed Thoreau's belief that unjust laws must be met with peaceful resistance. In his letter from Birmingham jail, King did what Thoreau had done nearly a century before. He transformed a prison cell into a pulpit of conscience. And even now, when people rise in protest, when they choose integrity over convenience, when they ask not what is popular, but what is right, Thoreau is there, not as a ghost, but as a guide. He never sought fame. He never imagined that his words would cross centuries. But that is the strange power of truth. It does not need a stage. It needs only to be lived and written down, to live deliberately, to resist injustice, to walk to the beat of a different drummer. These were not just ideas. They were the architecture of a life that proved that rebellion does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers through leaves, or appears in a single act of refusal, or lingers in the pages of a journal left behind. Thoreau once said, "The question is not what you look at, but what you see." And perhaps in looking back at him, we begin to see ourselves more clearly. History is not just a list of dates and battles. It is a mirror, reflecting who we are and who we might become. In the life of Henry David Thoreau, we find more than a man who lived alone in the woods. We find a voice unafraid to stand still in a rushing world, and to speak when silence was easier. At The Past Unfolded, we bring you these forgotten echoes, not as distant relics, but as living truths. Because sometimes, to understand the future, we must first unfold the past.